right, so welcome everyone to our final presentation today. Our capstone project is on retrofitting subdivisions for sustainability with an example from Latin America. So we're going to be looking at ways we can boost social justice and also improve sustainable community development in Mérida, a city in Mexico. So I'll start off and introduce ourselves with our names. So my name is Marielle Jacquez.
And I am Nicole Blaisdell.
And I'm Panayota Iliopoulos, and we're jumping to the agenda.
Yes, so here's our agenda. So we will be covering a few things. We're going to start off with a brief introduction on the social housing policy history of Mexico. And then we'll take a closer look at our site location, which is Jardines del Norte in Mérida. And then we'll summarize our first resident meeting, the 2023 meeting, and also the January 2024 meeting. And then we'll jump into our actual proposal and our goals, which are increasing walkability, increasing accessibility and safety as well, through things like the creation of a green walkway and adding microspaces. Then we'll summarize our most recent resident meeting and describe some changes we plan on making to our project based on that feedback and how we expect to integrate with the existing spaces in the project site. And then lastly, we'll jump into an analysis of our proposal. So our expected benefits and outcomes, as well as how we think it will benefit social justice in Mérida. Then we'll look at our next steps and we'll finish off with a Q&A session. So right now I'll pass it off to Nicole to give us a brief introduction.
Okay, so we're going to start off with a just brief introduction on the social housing policy agenda in Mexico. The rapid population growth between the 1990s and the 2010s, it significantly increased the demand for housing, particularly for low and moderate income families. The 1917 Mexico Constitution, it guarantees access to decent housing, which makes the government's responsibility to ensure that every family has a respectable home. And this was addressed through subsidized construction of mass-produced social housing, and it led to the development of large fraccionamientos or subdivisions. Typically, they are built along the outskirts of cities where there is more availability of large plots of land. And this approach did produce over 10 million homes for low to moderate income families. And the strategy primarily focused on the quantity of units in a copy and paste format. It was built primarily to meet numerical targets, and they often lacked the infrastructure such as necessary services to foster community. They had a spatial mismatch between places like schools, employment, healthcare facilities, and grocery stores. And so one of the major issues is not fostering a sense of community, but also having a long distance between where people live and where they work. And you can go to the next slide.
Okay, so like Nicole just mentioned, subdivisions in Mexico have experienced a variety of consequences from Mexico's poor social housing policies. So the subdivision that we want to focus on for our project site, like I said earlier, is called Jardines del Norte, which is a fraccionamiento. The image here to the left shows the general area in Mérida. So you can see it's located in the northeastern part of the city. The image to the right shows a more detailed look at the fraccionamiento. And so we chose this specific site because it's a pretty good example of a typical modern day fraccionamiento in Mérida. It's about 688,000 square meters. To put that into perspective, that's similar to the size of Tempe here in Arizona. And as of 2020, there were about 4,000 residents and about 1,600 homes. So it is fairly average when you consider that most fraccionamientos here can range from all the way from 200 to 10,000 homes. There's also very little green space per person. So if you do the math, you actually would see that there's only there's much less than the minimum from the World Health Organization, which is at least 9 square meters. So there's only 6.3 square meters allotted per resident. They're definitely lacking green spaces. In terms of quality of life, our surveys found that about half of them agree that the sidewalks are in mediocre condition, and about 1/5 of all the housing in the fraccionamiento is completely vacant. So these statistics highlight that Jardines del Norte is critically lacking green, accessible open spaces, but also walkable streets. You can go to the next slide.
So in 2023, we had the first survey, which Mariel briefly mentioned. It gave us some insights into the various aspects of life in the neighborhood, including the housing quality, walkability, automobile dependence, street infrastructure, as well as access to goods and public services that was mentioned. And on the picture on the right, you can see the final evaluation of the neighborhood according to the results of the survey. And in a follow-up meeting that happened in 2024, in January, the residents reaffirmed the concerns that were identified in the initial survey, while they also gave us some additional concerns. Firstly, they mentioned traffic-related issues like the noise pollution and safety concerns. And then they also expressed dissatisfaction with the declining community engagement, such as the increasing isolation, a lack of meaningful interaction, and the neglect of the public spaces of the area. They also proposed to us like starting small with community projects to foster interaction and address some of the shared needs. While some of the feedback that we got from the municipal planning, they acknowledge the urban issues from the past housing development policies, such as the previously mentioned like urban sprawl, lack of community, and limited access to jobs and services. And the City and Municipal Planning Institute are focusing on holistic community development for the future fraccionamientos. They mentioned to us some initiatives that could be helpful for our project, such as the gestión de espacios públicos, which means public space management, and also the participatory budgeting, which would involve residents in improving their communities. But they also mentioned some of the funding challenges due to Merida's high living standards that limit the eligibility for federal funding. So with that, for our proposal, we decided to retrofit the main avenue to increase the walkability and decrease traffic that goes through the fraccionamiento. And on the picture on the right, you can see the exact location of the avenue highlighted with red. And the other highlighted locations are some of the public spaces like the archaeological site here with the yellow and some vacant lots and unattended parks. So for our proposal, we would like to remove one lane on each side of the avenue, install some crosswalks and ramps, reduce the cross streets, expand the median in the middle to create the new pedestrian walkway, increase the local vegetation and use local materials to create the pedestrian walkway, as well as add some pocket parks in the walkway, and also add bike lanes on both sides of the walkway. And these all will be further analyzed in the upcoming slides. And I will pass it to Mariel for walkability.
Thank you, Pagiota. So since our focus is on improving walkability, we need to be able to define it before we can identify it. So Michael Southworth, a notable urban planning researcher, defined it as the extent to which the built environment supports and encourages walking. We can even go a step further beyond that and say that truly walkable spaces should recognize that streets are public spaces, that should prioritize pedestrians and not cars, and that should accommodate a diverse range of needs for different individuals. So all the way from children to the elderly to residents with accessibility needs. So in terms of more technical terms, there are ways you can measure it. There's three categories. Depending on the goal of your project, you can use one or multiple. So the first one is objectively, or basically through factual data. So like land mix ratio, for example. There's also subjectively, which is through personal thoughts and observations, which can be found through things like surveys. And then lastly, there's distinctively, which is from a third party observation. So depending on the goal of your project, you can use either one. We intend to use all three likely. And you can go to the next slide, please.
So there are various access and safety initiatives that we have incorporated into our proposal. The first one we can start off talking about is traffic calming, which is essential for creating a safer and more pleasant urban environment for pedestrians. It can be achieved through measures such as speed limits or just road design changes in general. And combining the reduced speed limit with certain things like lane reduction, speed bumps, and pedestrian only zones that can reduce traffic, but also enhance safety. Restricting access overall for motorized vehicles or cars, and reducing the number of lanes along the main avenue. We aim to lower the traffic intensity in the speed by doing so. And this reduction, it won't only diminish the dominance of cars along the main avenue, but also enhance the human dimensions of the area and encourage a more local use of public space. And by reducing the lanes of traffic along each side street from 2 lanes to 1 lane, we can create more room for pedestrians, cyclists, non-motorized vehicle users, and just foster a safer environment. Reducing the number of cross streets along the main avenue is another calming measure, traffic calming measure. And there's currently 10 cross streets along the main avenue, and our proposal will limit this to 2 cross streets overall to reduce traffic. And while this may increase traffic on the side streets, studies show that traffic calming can lead to an overall decrease in traffic as people adjust their travel habits and opt for fewer car trips. And public outreach initiatives can also be used to raise awareness about these new measures. Alongside reducing the number of lanes, we plan to narrow the width of the driving lanes from 3.5 meters to 3.25 meters to create additional space for pedestrians and cyclists. There will be crosswalks placed at regular intervals along the main avenue, and they will be accessible to all users, including those in wheelchairs. We'll also incorporate features like pedestrian ramps and audible signals. And to create our actual pedestrian walkway, as I mentioned before, 1 lane of vehicle traffic on each side of the street will be removed. And that remaining space will be utilized to create a bike circuit and also the pedestrian walkway. And you can go to the next slide.
So for the creation of the green walkway, we decided to use limestone dust, which is locally abundant and allows for water drainage and provides a comfortable and cool surface for the pedestrians. But also it can give accessibility for those with mobility challenges, since it can give a smooth, firm surface, as we can see in the picture on the right side. But also we chose this material because it will add a unique touch to the city's beauty and further reinforce Mérida's moniker, which is La Ciudad Blanca, which means the white city. And as for the vegetation, when we were selecting the appropriate trees for the walkway, we considered the area's climate and topography. So we wanted vegetation that is appropriate for the weather conditions and would not require too much watering or maintenance, etc. Also, except for the ornamental trees for the walkway, we decided to add also fruit-bearing trees, since they would not only add to the beauty of the area, but would also provide an opportunity for the community to connect with nature and interact with each other as well. So next slide, we'll talk about the microspaces.
And so along this walkway that our team envisions to add, we also envision 4 micro spaces that can be places where residents can gather and spend time talking or sitting or walking, whatever they want. So the first one here is a tall art structure. It would be located right at the entrance of the walkway. So ideally, this would be a culturally significant piece that can celebrate the Mayan culture of the area and welcome the residents to the walkway in a way that's interesting and striking. So in our example here in this image, we used an image of a Mayan god called Yumkash. He's regarded as the god of nature in Mayan mythology. So it would be very relevant in this project site. And adding this, it could be done by collaborating with local college students at the nearby Art Institute. So that can help us actively work with the residents of the area. And around here, there would also be a pocket park added with some seating and native foliage for both aesthetics and shading purposes. The second space is another pocket park, but this one would further encourage creativity. So it would have a curving path and monochromatic seating and flooring to add some uniqueness to the area. So the image used here is an example from Mexico City. If you can see it on the floor, they use some colorful patterns. So it's something that's already done in their parks. So it wouldn't be anything extraordinary. There would also be some tall blank slabs added for residents to freely use. So it would be a place not only for residents to convene and get together, but it could also be an outlet for them if they want to creatively express themselves. And here there would also be native vegetation for natural shading. The next space is a walkable herb garden shown in this third image here. In the center would be another culturally significant piece. So this time it would be a plant, which is the sipche tree. It's seen as a healing plant in Mayan culture. And some other common Mexican culinary herbs that can be easily grown in Merida's hot climate would be the chile pequin, which is a pepper, epazote, which is an herb, and Mexican oregano. And we would also add some circular seating to the area to help facilitate conversations. The last microspace here is another pocket park, but this one would have a dedicated space for humans and one for dogs. 70% of households in Merida actually own a dog, so it's really important that we add spaces that are good not only for human residents, but also the dogs that have to go on their daily walks and they need safe and convenient places to do so. So that's where our proposal focuses on adding these kind of diverse spaces. One prominent feature in the human side of the park would be these confidant chairs shown in this image here. So these are already pretty common in Merida and Mexico in general. And it's a more interesting and personal take on the traditional seating types usually found in parks. And the dog park would have a water fountain in it, of course, which is really pertinent for Merida's dry savanna climate. And you can move on to the next slide, please.
So in March 2024, there was a second meeting for both the with both the residents and the Municipal Planning Institute that happened again in order to discuss our project and get some feedback regarding the changes that we want to make. And from the meeting with Ricardo Bollo, who is the director of Merida's Municipal Planning Institute, he expressed a strong support for the retrofit project and confirmed that it complied with the city's regulations. He also said that some of the project costs could be, such as the modification of the lanes and the median strip, could be covered by the city's urban development budget, and that also the municipal participatory planning initiative could provide some additional resources. He also suggested that the residents could create a neighborhood organization to advocate for this project to be included in the municipal development plan under the incoming mayor. So we could get a little bit more boost for this project. And regarding the meeting with the residents, we also got some really good feedback that we included on the changes that we made. So the first feedback that we got was to increase the number of cross streets, because the first time we had only one cross street and we added another one in order like to not create more congestion in the area. The second one was to provide mobility options to increase accessibility for skateboarders, skaters, and people with limited mobility. And the last one was to include amenities for pets and people of all ages. And according to those feedback that we got, we did make those changes. And as the Mario and Nicole mentioned those changes in the previous slides, we did change the number of cross streets, and we also propose an alternative to add like small ramps or walkways of permeable asphalt in the pocket parks or the spaces for conviviality in order to increase the accessibility for people with mobility issues if the limestone paving is not sufficient enough for accessibility. And as Mariel mentioned, in one of the pocket park, we proposed adding the pet-friendly area for the cooling with a water fountain. However, we were not able to include an area for the skateboarders in the pedestrian walkway because it would reduce the greenery, and unfortunately, we decided against it. Maybe we could create another area just for the skateboarders, but maybe not in the walkway. So we're gonna move to the next slide for the integration. Mario?
So these are three spaces that currently exist in the project site that we plan to add on to. So the first one here to the left is featured right before the entrance of the walkway. So right now in this one, there's an existing green field that is used by some residents recreationally for things like sports like soccer, but there's no actual proper sports equipment here. So the plan would be to add those amenities so residents can use this for a variety of sports. And we would also add a playground space for kids with permeable paving, and also a variety of climbing structures and even an herb garden. So some easy to grow and safe to grow herbs would be basil and oregano. So these could be a really simple and educative way for kids to learn about plant growth and the importance of eating fresh and healthy food. And another amenity that we can add is a community orchard where residents can regularly visit and collect fresh produce. The next space is currently, oh, sorry.
No,
The
I'm
next,
sorry.
the next space is currently a large private parking lot. So this one is ideal for turning it into an entertainment venue type of place. So there would be, for example, a stage with lots of open seating and available space for food and drink vendors. So we envision this to be a really socially and culturally vibrant part of the town that can help generate economic activity. And the last space is a vacant unpaved lot. So it's basically an open green field. This one is ideal for pop-up activities like food trucks and temporary open air food markets or tianguis, both which are very common in Mexico and are really common places for residents to gather with their family and friends and spend time there. And this is another way that we can help support the local food vendors and generate local economic activity. What's the next slide?
So regarding the benefits, the reductions on the lines and the speed limit will not only reduce the traffic that goes through the fraccionamiento, but it will also improve the quality of the air and would decrease the noise pollution. Moreover, walking and cycling in areas in a quieter environment and a healthier environment will improve both physical but also mental health. So this would lead to a safer and a higher quality environment for the residents. Also, the location of the project was strategically chosen because this avenue, as mentioned by Mariel, it can also it can integrate with the available public spaces of the surrounding areas, as well as like the archaeological side and the other spaces. But also it has like small private markets and stores that people are usually using to go. So this could give a chance for more community engagement in the neighborhood. And Nicole?
So now we're going to talk about the importance of considering social justice within urban design and planning, because urban sustainability cannot be fully achieved without incorporating social justice principles. These principles being accessibility, inclusivity, equity, fairness, diversity, and opportunity. And they are essential for creating urban environments that promote well-being and prosperity for all residents, as well as for preventing discrimination, embracing diversity, and upholding human rights. Ensuring that everyone has equal access to adequate housing, essential services, resources, opportunity is very important for fostering social well-being, and addressing disparities in access based on socioeconomic status, environment, education will promote a more equitable outcome and enhance the quality of life for city residents. In promoting inclusivity through tolerance, justice, affordability, and equity, it creates a sense of belonging and cohesion. Active citizen involvement is also very important in urban planning for promoting opportunity, inclusivity, and fairness, and to create spaces for all voices and opinions to be heard that will ensure urban development reflects the diverse needs and preferences of a community. And prioritizing, once again, social justice within urban sustainability, it can ensure that cities are not only sustainable, but equitable and inclusive for everyone. And for the next steps for our project, it is a multi-year process for the actual implementation through various stages. From June to August of 2024, we plan to build community support, establish representative neighborhood organizations, collaborate with the Sustainable Development Unit to create the community orchard, and also prepare a formal proposal for the municipal development plan. And we also plan to also work with the municipality throughout 2025 to 2027 to hopefully get everything done. From September to December of 2024, we do plan to implement the community orchard by then, and also develop a preliminary design and budget, and then also identifying funding resources and initiating fundraising activities. From January to June of 2025, we want to finalize budgeting and design implementations, and also create a management and a maintenance plan. And we want to also continue working with the municipality, local residents on fundraising, and hopefully begin to start stage one, or the early stages of our project, which is to expand the median and then reduce the driving lanes and also eliminate cross streets. By July to December of 2025, we plan to plant trees and conduct some initial landscaping, install pedestrian ramps, and complete the bicycle circuit. And then from January to June of 2026, we hope to have landscaping complete and begin working on pocket parks and microspaces. And then the final stage would be from July to December of 2026, where we want to finalize all the pocket parks and the microspaces.
These are our resources, and we're open for any questions.
I'll let Khadija kick us off here.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khadija, and I'm here with my teammates, Michael, Layla, and Annie, and we'll be talking about our project, which is comparing carbon emissions in residential buildings with a focus on total, embodied, and operational carbon. Next slide. Okay. Today, we'll be presenting 4 major parts, with me introducing our project background. Layla will be going through methodology. Michael will be going through data analysis, and Annie will conclude us with findings and implications. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So throughout this project, we have been assessing and analyzing the total energy use and carbon emissions in the residential building sector. We've calculated and compared the overall energy use over 4 residential building projects in similar climate zones across the United States. And just so that everyone can kind of get on the same page, I'll be explaining some of the key terms and topics throughout our project. So when we say residential buildings, we're referring to single-use family homes. And we choose to focus on residential buildings because as a whole, buildings are responsible for 40% of total energy use in the United States, and that includes 75% of all electricity use and 35% of the nation's carbon emissions. And the US's total energy use for 2013, that total energy consumption for residential buildings alone was 19.7%. So our next topic, passive house. It's an energy standard that's dedicated to really reducing building energy consumption through passive heating and cooling techniques while also enhancing overall comfort. These techniques include continuous insulation, thermal bridge-free detailing, air tightness, high performance windows and doors, ventilation with heat and or energy recovery, and some architects also like to add compact form. So like I said, passive house is a building energy standard, and building energy standards usually describe how buildings should be constructed in order to save energy more cost effectively. They're not mandatory, but they serve as recommendations with some variation for like different regional climates. So, however, energy codes are mandatory and they're regulated by national and state organizations, kind of like the New York City Department of Buildings. We have to comply with these codes in order to be able to obtain any permits for like building, construction, retrofit, stuff like that. So in the US, there is no national energy code, but there is a model energy code, and that's done by the International Energy Council. Operational carbon refers to the amount of carbon dioxide emissions produced during the day-to-day operations and maintenance of a building. So these primarily are like from heating, cooling, lighting, and appliances. And embodied carbon is the sum of all carbon dioxide emissions released during the life cycle stages. So think raw material extraction, transportation, manufacturing, maintenance, end of life, like all of that. So next slide. The thing is, to accurately understand a building's total emissions, we need to know and combine both the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon. So unfortunately, embodied carbon typically isn't accounted for in calculations for total energy use of buildings. So our research intends to include both operational and embodied carbon and test the impact that material choice has, as well as the impact that building energy standards and codes have on total building energy use and consumption. Next slide. And basically, we aim to test that through exploring these following questions. So does the operational carbon of passive house projects offset the embodied carbon of passive house construction? What are the embodied carbon versus operational carbon of various building energy standards? And then what are the effects of different building materials on embodied carbon? And now I'll be handing it off to Layla, and she'll be going through our methodology. Yeah.
Hi, so we broke our methodology section into 5 main steps, which is more or less how we worked chronologically through our project. Next. The first step was establish our scope of work. How many buildings are we gonna calculate all that data for? Where are they? How are we gonna work through this so many different energy performance standards that are available? So our step 1 again was, let's choose the buildings. We went due to limited time only with 4 residential buildings. And luckily we finished on time. We weren't even sure if we were going to finish all of them. And they're actually real projects that are being built or will be soon. They're all similar in their low-rise single-family type, 1 to 2 floors. They're located in 4 different regions. Next. we chose these four just for geographic diversity. As you can see, one is in New York, the other one is in North Carolina, the third is in Colorado, and the fourth is in Washington State. And each one has a different climate zone. Then we went to step 2. Next slide. Since our research was looking at 2 factors that can affect the embodied carbon, the material choice and the building codes and standards. So we went for energy code and standards. We wanted to establish a baseline to compare everything else to. And here we chose the IECC 2018, which is our minimum energy code. Then, as Khadija mentioned, we were curious about the passive house standard, which is being the most stringent energy standard and the best energy performance building as for now. But that was operational energy quantification, not necessarily the embodied. So this is our second standard that we're going to compare to minimum code. And for a third choice, we went with the Department of Energy net zero energy standard, and we just decided not to go with any other standard for comparisons because the time was very limited. And this establishes step 3. Next, please. All right. Now, for step 3, we want to select the materials because the materials will affect the embodied carbon. For this step, we did not look into the total embodied carbon of the building. We focus on the building envelope or the building shell and mainly the thermal layers, but we excluded the windows and doors, again, for time limitation. But this was enough for us to make comparisons. So taking into consideration the insulation materials and their specific embodied carbon, the embodied carbon emissions from manufacturing and transporting that material within the same energy standard. So we established 3 types of energy of insulation types: the low embodied type, the conventional, which has a medium quantified embodied carbon, and the high embodied carbon material. As you can see, there's a little section here just to show that the insulation thicknesses within the same standard, we did not change the thicknesses. We only changed the type of insulation. But from standard to standard, we did change the insulation thicknesses. The next slide, please. Next. So this slide is just to show you what type of insulation materials we used within each energy standard. On the left is what we established as perceived low embodied carbon materials. On the right is what we perceived as high embodied carbon insulation materials. And in the middle are what we call conventional, which has the reason I'm saying perceived is because initially during our research, that's what we thought they were: low, medium, or conventional, and high embodied quantities of CO2 equivalents. But we, after we analyzed the 72 examples, I found out that there were some surprises. And that's why we are showing here the real CO2 or embodied carbon for each material. Next slide, please. Now, this takes us to step 4, which is analyzing and calculating the the most important thing of our project, the operational carbon and the embodied carbon for each energy standard and for each building and for each insulation type. Now, as for the operational carbon, we use the available data from what's called PHPP software. The PHPP software is a translation for Passive House Planning Package software, is an energy modeling tool. It was designed to calculate energy demand of a passive house building, but we were able to use it, and it perfectly simulated the energy use based on a different energy standard. This we did changing the thickness of the insulation layers, and we were able to obtain the results. This took us to step 5, please, next. Now, to calculate the embodied carbon, which we did, again, 36 times, we used the pH ribbon. The pH ribbon is an Excel workbook that adds functionality to the PHPP. It's an Excel plugin and can be used to enter and verify selected data into the active PHPP and add carbon data and analysis to the active PHPP. So again, we established the thickness of the material within each energy standard using 3 different types of materials, and we obtained a lot of data, a lot of combinations, and we encountered a couple of surprises in the way. And here I leave you with with Michael, who is going to present the analysis of our project. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Layla. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So hey, everyone, this is Michael Farah. As Layla mentioned, I'll be presenting the outputs of our calculations and analysis that Layla pointed out through our methodology. So this section will illustrate the operational, embodied, and total carbon emissions for the residential buildings that we selected for our research. So this first chart summarizes the operational carbon calculations for the residential home we modeled in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've produced charts like this for each residential project, but for simplicity, I'll only show one example of each type of calculation throughout this section. So using the PHPP software, we were able to model and analyze the annual operational energy of each home. As Khadija pointed out earlier, this is referring to the source emissions to operate the home, including electricity, heating and cooling, appliances, etc. So this chart is showing the annual operational energy use across 3 different building energy standards, measuring energy use in metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Our unit is CO2 equivalent emissions, again, since this is the model across different standards and not the actual measured CO2 emissions. These figures represent the energy use for one single year. Another point to consider when reading this chart is the building energy standards become more strict as we move from left to right. We'll explore the impact of these requirements as I discuss these calculations. In the case of Charlotte, North Carolina, if the home is built to 2018 IECC standards, also referred to synonymously as to code, the result is higher CO2 equivalent emissions, regardless of the embodied carbon of the insulation materials selected. For all types of insulation materials, models following the Charlotte PHI, also known as the Passive House Institute standards, have significantly lower CO2 equivalent emissions compared to the code or DOE net zero standards. So to summarize, the big takeaway from this calculation, which we saw not only in Charlotte, but across all 4 projects, is that the Passive House standard, right, this one here, is the more strict standard resulted in the lowest operational carbon emissions, regardless of the installation materials selected. While insulation materials may have some impact on operational carbon, generally speaking, we saw in our calculations that choice of energy standard has a more significant impact on reducing operational CO2 equivalent emissions than the type of insulation material used. This next example is showing the embodied carbon calculations for the residential home we selected in Sugarloaf, New York. just under 60 miles north of City College's campus. As was the case with my previous slide, this is just one example of the calculation we've done to represent embodied carbon calculations, but we've applied the same calculation to all 4 projects. For embodied carbon calculations, we use that pH ribbon plugin that Layla described. So the calculation here is showing the embodied energy required to construct a home, factoring in the CO2 equivalent emissions from manufacturing materials and transporting the materials from the manufacturer to the project. Another note with this metric, as mentioned in the methodology, is this embodied carbon calculation is only considering the building envelope, meaning we're only looking at the embodied carbon of the insulation materials and structural layers. We're not including windows, doors, or plumbing or other components that would be part of a broader life cycle analysis, since the insulation materials were most relevant to testing our hypothesis. So, given all that context, what you can see in this chart is that the PHI, or Passive House standards, result in the highest embodied carbon when compared to the code or DOE net zero standards. This is the result of the strictness of the PHI building energy standard. Another takeaway is that the type of insulation material has a significant measurable impact on the embodied carbon emissions. This was different than operational carbon, as I pointed out, which saw relatively static emissions across the different material selections, right? If I just jump back, right, we can see that across, as we go from left to right, low, conventional, high, it's relatively static, across the, the different standards. But when we jump here, you can see there's a great increase in energy emissions moving from low to high. You can also see that manufacturing dominates the total embodied CO2 for all standards and insulation material types. This is, it's particularly high in models that used higher embodied insulation materials. Transportation emissions are relatively low, but still notable, especially when considering products that come from overseas. We also saw that based on the materials we selected, the embodied carbon of the code-built home was relatively similar to the embodied carbon of DOE net zero, with DOE being marginally higher across both low and conventional insulation material choices. The primary takeaway from this chart and the trend we saw across all 4 projects is material selection can have an impact on embodied carbon, and that Passive House is a more energy-intensive standard for embodied emissions when compared to code or DOE net zero. So we'll explore the impacts of this trade-off in just a few slides, but as you may have gleaned from the past 2, there is sort of an inverse effect between building energy standard and energy use when comparing operational to embodied. The more strict code, as we move from left to right in these clusters, results in a higher embodied carbon and a lower operational carbon. This gets particularly interesting when we start looking at the total energy use for each project. So this next calculation shows total energy use, a sum of embodied carbon and operational carbon. Since our operational carbon calculations are annual, this chart is showing the total year 1 operational CO2 equivalent emissions plus the embodied carbon emitted from manufacturing and transportation while the home was constructed. This example is showing only the project in Seattle, and the analysis was applied to all 4 projects. One key takeaway from this chart is that the difference in embodied operational energy, for the most part, embodied energy makes up a larger portion of total energy use in year 1. Another important note, as mentioned before, is as embodied carbon of the insulation material increases in each model, operational carbon mostly stays the same. I've included this table at the bottom on the slide to help further illustrate these calculations so folks have an idea of how these figures are produced. This is only one example of the total energy use calculation, but we can draw further insights when looking at all 4 projects together. So this chart is showing the total emissions calculations for all projects. This is summarizing the 36 scenarios that Layla pointed out earlier. This chart sums up the outcome of our applied methodology and shows where we've input this data for the analysis in a pretty concise manner. Consolidating the data like this enables more effective analysis and comparison. And on the next slide, we have a chart that visually shows the comparison of building energy standards and material choice. So this chart is showing the total energies for all projects across all standards and insulation material types. There's a lot of data being shown here, all 36 scenarios organized by clusters to demonstrate the material selection and energy standards in each model. We've been calling this the mother of all charts, as it allows us to really start deriving those insights that answer these questions that we want to explore. The red arrows here are pointing to the Passive House standards to more easily see takeaways most relevant to the research problems. We're able to see some insights from material choice using this calculation, but the impact of code choice is not completely clear from this calculation. At year 1, high embodied carbon insulation materials generally lead to significantly higher total emissions across all standards. That would be like the third cluster on the right in each instance, right? We're seeing higher totals in the third cluster across all 4 here. However, regarding code choice, there's variable results in total energy across all these calculations, with passive house usually being the greatest. So to really see the impact of code choice, we took this calculation one step further and evaluated the energy use across the total span of time that a person or family typically lives in a home, which according to our research is about 13 years. This is my final slide here. So when looking at the 13-year total emissions for all projects, we can more effectively evaluate the impact that code choice has. In every instance, the total energy use is lower when selecting passive house than for IECC code or DOE across 13 years. The bars in green here are showing the passive house models. This is a result of the lower operational carbon emissions by passive house year over year, and therefore a slower rate of growth in this metric. So this enables us to see those broader takeaways that further test our analysis and allow us to think about considerations like carbon reduction goals and emissions offsetting. And while passive house has generally much greater CO2 equivalent embodied emissions than other standards, the payoff is clearly evident when zooming out and assessing the total amount of time that someone lives in their home. So I'll now pass things along to Annie for more in-depth insights and implications derived from these analyses.
Awesome, thank you. If we go to the next slide, we do have a sample analysis. So this was done for a house located in Boulder, Colorado, just kind of showing how total CO2 equivalents change over time during the entire, during the use of the home. And so when we analyzed the data, as Michael has said, what we saw was that the embodied carbon of a house that's built to a stricter regulation required more embodied carbon upfront due to the dimensions to meet that like voter standard. So a house that's built to passive house standards had the most embodied carbon, and this was something that we expected to happen. The other thing that we wanted to explore was how the total CO2 equivalents would change over time as the house was being used, and how the operational carbon would compare to the embodied carbon. And so if we look at this graph for this house in Boulder, the trend that we noticed in this house, and also true for all the other houses, was that the difference in embodied carbon between code versus passive house was very quickly offset by the operational carbon. So in this particular example, we saw that the difference got offset within the first year of use. And then from there, the house that's built to passive house standards, so that's like the dark orange line, has a significantly slower rate of growth for carbon dioxide in comparison to code or DOE net zero. Next slide, please. And this is just another analysis that we did. So when we compiled the data for all of our houses, we saw that every single house was able to offset that embodied carbon within the first 4 years of usage. And like Michael had mentioned, a family on average spends 13 years in a house. And then if we look at these bars a little more closely, houses that are built with low embodied or conventional materials, the time it took to offset the embodied carbon was even faster. So these took only 2 years to offset. Next slide, please. And then we also looked at the total carbon dioxide equivalent over the span of 13 years. And then in this graph, every bar shows the ratio of carbon dioxide equivalents being produced over 13 years for a house that's built to code, and then comparing it to the emissions for it being built to passive house. And so if we look at the very first bar, it shows that the house that's built to code is going to emit 265% more carbon dioxide equivalents than if it was built to passive house. And so this is true for every location. Every house that's built to code will emit over double the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents compared to its passive house counterparts over the course of 13 years. Next slide, please. And so just kind of synthesizing everything together, all of our findings are crucial in the bigger picture concerning carbon emissions. So a lot of national and international agencies have set emission reduction targets, the most prominent being based off the research done for the Paris Climate Agreement. And so with the Paris Climate Agreement, the aim is to meet the goal of holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And then the IPCC showing the need ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to remain consistent with that, the IPCC also set the goal for net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, and they had 10 key solutions to help meet that goal. And of those 10, 3 are directly related to emissions of the building sector. So those 3 were to invest in clean energy, to decarbonize buildings, and also decarbonize materials like cement and steel and plastic, which is why we did our research on emissions from buildings and from different kinds of materials. Next slide, please. And so just some major takeaways, just to run the point home, like Michael said, from our data, we were able to conclude that a building that was built to passive house standards was better for every scenario, regardless of location and material, and that passive house had a lot, more drastic benefits, especially as time progressed for the time that's spent in the home, in comparison to code or other standards. And then for materials, a potential prediction was that high embodied carbon would have a better payoff in the long run due to its better performance. And this, while this statement is true for the operational side, it is countered by the embodied carbon that's needed to make and transport the material. So high embodied carbon insulation materials was not necessarily a better alternative to low or conventional materials that we chose over the course of 13 years. And we also had a lot of ideas for extensions, which unfortunately did not come to fruition due to time constraints. So some other factors that could be researched can include cost efficiency, modeling the emissions for the entire house and looking at all of the different parts and not just the shell of the building. And also this methodology could be replicated for a wider range of materials. So we looked at really specific ones and focused on insulation. But again, this could be replicated for a wider breadth of materials and material choices. And that's it for our presentation. Thanks for listening.
Cool, perfect.
Awesome.
All right. Yeah, so we're gonna have 3 different approaches to climate justice and urban resilience in New York City. One is gonna be mine, the other one is gonna be Ninet's, and the other one is gonna be Lina. Nina is gonna have a more theoretical approach, Lina community-driven, myself market and economics and however you want to put it. So yeah, let's go ahead. Nina.
All right. Yeah, so basically I will skip over a lot of the introductory kind of definitions and concepts as it pertains to decoloniality and anticipatory governance, because we already covered them in quite detail last semester. So let us just dive right in as to the work that we've done so far this semester. Okay, so why do I include this one? Because it is impossible to understand climate justice without understanding social equity. And it isn't possible to understand equity without delving into forms of governance. You see, in ancient India and China, free market economies and innovation went hand in hand with societal equity. The Arthashastra is a highly revered book on statecraft authored by Chanakya, depicted in the art, who was an Indian polymath during the Mauryan Empire about 2,300 years ago. In his book, he vividly describes a free market economy, aka capitalism. Now, mind you, this is like around 350 BC, so these are ancient times. So social inequities driven by capitalism is essentially a modern relic, perfected by colonial and neo-colonial countries who led segregation on the basis of religion, race, and greed. Africa is an apt example of this. A continent ensnared in a cyclical pattern of climate-induced inequality, which can be attributable to the absolute nonsensical demarcation of the contemporary national boundaries by the colonial powers. And most of the papers I came across during literature review for this blatantly blame capitalism as one of the root causes of social inequity. And I beg to differ. My argument here is that capitalism and socialism shouldn't be looked at as binaries, but the underlying mechanisms of their nuances should be well understood and studied for their effective co-implementation. The phrase co being the key term here. Because let's not forget that innovation gets stifled due to lack of incentives in completely socialist societies, and they get stuck in a rut over the long term. Next slide. We will just glance through this slide since I already explained this in detail last semester. The key point here is to basically understand that anticipatory governance involves using anticipation to comprehend the connection between a diverse present and its various potential futures. And to do that, we have 4 approaches. Next slide. This is basically the premise of my entire research, this Venn diagram. There are papers talking about decoloniality and anticipatory governance in a mutually exclusive way, but I have brought them together. There is a clear overlap between the concepts of decoloniality and anticipatory governance. Hence, I would like to put forth the argument that anticipatory governance is, in fact, a decolonial framework. Next slide. So using this framework, I tried to envision a concept of intersectional climate justice. Adaptation planning is one of the subcategories under this intersectional approach. I considered 7 interrelated facets for this, and these are in no particular order per se. So first, municipalities should take into account historical consequences of socio-environmental injustices for the concerned community. Private funding sources are absolutely essential, but they need to be held more accountable via regulatory frameworks, aka the government, that oversee these resilience projects. This includes participatory planning procedures and/or institutional reorganization that seek to fairly include the viewpoints of disadvantaged groups. The capacity of lower-income residents to preserve their homes can be protected by a municipality putting in place regulations that emphasize housing and land rights. And this can be exemplified by Columbia University's Manhattanville campus, where they built a building which ended up dislocating the original inhabitants of the area without proper compensation. How do we stop this from happening in the future? Well, we kind of like make sure that these kinds of regulations are put and they're enforced / implemented in the proper way. Interventions for the development of green and gray spaces, which are accessible, safe, and shaded, where folks can take refuge from the heat and get together as a community. That is another important facet. The incentivization of the participation of members of the concerned community and providing them with financial compensation, which would also lead to the creation for chances for skill development and job training, would be the last but not the least facet that I consider. Next slide. So it is impossible to deliver climate justice to disadvantaged communities without place-based planning or location-based planning. And I consider these interconnected 4 facets to the concept of place-based planning. And this is because local communities have complex connections to the features of their location. The needs, goals, and knowledge of the concerned communities take center stage in the decision-making process, as opposed to a more expert-driven / technocratic approach. The recognition of the knowledge that comes from a variety of often overlooked experiences with locality and spatiality, that is indigenous, contextual, and community-specific. These inclusive strategies advocate for socially created urban environments, which are representative of the many histories and daily lives of their residents, aka a pluralistic present. And in fact, Marielle's slide on microspaces during Group 4's presentation was a great example of this. For example, she mentioned the inclusion of the Mayan god of nature sculpture celebrating Mayan culture. So that is a perfect example of this particular facet. And last but not the least, advocacy for the recognition and protection of informal, contested, and often invisible urban places as sanctuaries and heavens for residents of the concerned community should also be very, very important. Now, these are just some of the concepts I wanted to highlight from my ideation of intersectional climate justice, but there are more subcategories on the paper itself. Next slide. So in conclusion / future work recommendations, again, I would just like to say that the main thing I've tried to do through this research is bring together the concepts of decoloniality and anticipatory governance to analyze climate justice, because I couldn't find any existing literature using this particular nexus. Scholars and practitioners must diligently strive to incorporate this pivot towards intersectionality, especially in the urban climate adaptation field, which would lay the groundwork for aligning planning theory with genuine, like truly genuine and justice-oriented action on the ground itself. And while my proposed decolonial framework offers a lot of novel insights, I do acknowledge potential limitations inherent in the methods involved. And these limitations stem from a lack of systematic, reproducible approaches, which may render them susceptible to bias. I pass it on to Alex.
Hey, thanks, Nina. So for my angle here, and I hope this works, I created a website because my part is integrating climate and housing policies to enhance property value while preserving communities' cultural identity. Basically, climate change is happening. How are we going to balance climate policies with housing policies so we can keep, we can contend like gentrification, for example. So I've created the Manhattanville retrofit profile, and I'm actually going to leave the link of the website on the chat. So I don't even know how to do that. No, okay, here we go. The reason why I choose Manhattanville is, and you're gonna see it in the website, I started analyzing different GIS maps. There is a bunch of similar phenomena happening. On the west side, there is basically an expansion of different multiple phenomena. Can be income distribution, gentrification, displacement, electricity usage, pollution, etc. But on the east side, it is stopping right before it starts in Harlem. So Manhattanville is actually operating as a crux of either these phenomena are going to keep expanding and determine the personality and the characteristics of New York City or not. But we have, Columbia University, we have City College that are big organizations with a lot of power to change and, divert where we want to go in the future. So this retrofit opportunity map is based on Local Law 97. So if we go here real quick, we're gonna see. I think I have it. Let me see. Can you see my screen? I'm sharing the website right now.
We're still in the slide.
Oh man. Okay. 1 second. I'm sorry. Huh. Okay. Now we go. Perfect. So in this website, you're gonna get a quick abstract here. You can download the full paper. Here you're gonna be able to find like all the information, data sets, but generally speaking, you can also download the databases and everything. But basically, we have a map telling us which of these buildings are complying already with Local Law 97, but also giving us other contexts as, for example, we have all of the buildings here, so we can have what year they were built, who is the owner, what are the consumption levels, their occupancy rate, energy, natural gas, fuel oil consumption, energy cost that has been also calculated, different energy index. I also included other large data sets based on New York Solar to estimate the ability for these properties to include solar energy as part of their retrofit proposition, projected annual penalties, and housing iterations, as for example, how many of these houses have had like partial evictions or, DOB violations, litigations against landlord, because a lot of times, not because they're complying with the retrofits and they're like climately friendly now, that means that they are not ongoing, there's no ongoing like abuse for the tenants. And here you're gonna be able to have like a huge table with all of this information, better rendered, to sort of like, benchmark and compare all of the properties in Manhattanville. And this would take us to the results that I am now trying to share. Okay, so we're here and slideshow. No, it didn't work. Okay. All right. So that will take us to some of the findings. The majority of the findings are available to download in the paper on the website, but 60% of the buildings within the study meet local law 97 requirements in Manhattanville. 15% comply with both local law 97 and local law 84, which is the benchmark. 4% have not disclosed energy and water data as required per local law 84. The first compliance period, this is an estimate in 2022, estimates that around 20 properties are going to face $500,000, increasing to almost $2 million out of all of the 311 properties available in Manhattanville. 58% of these ones have not undergone any significant alterations or retrofits since their construction was completed. Nearly 50% of the buildings, or 159, have made alterations around 35 years ago, and only 35 buildings have made alterations since the year 2000s, which means that some of the compliance that is happening on the first period of Local Law 97 are still old and might have been more of a patchwork that then for the most stringent compliance, they might not apply. Another note here is that Columbia-related organizations own 10% of the total building stock in Manhattanville area. So basically, the whole issue here is, there's going to be co-ops, there's going to be different landlord situations where historically marginalized communities own buildings, and since they can probably not afford the retrofits, they're going to have to sell their properties to large asset managers so they can retrofit it, which will also include increase the rent and the market rate apartment prices, taking out more opportunity for public housing and other things. So just overall future recommendations, I'm trying to condense so much in few slides. Pay attention to outdoor labor industries, meaning that construction in general and the retrofits in general are a pollutant itself, because we work with cement. I'm in the construction industry, and construction labor is being done outside. So the hotter the environment, the less productive we become, because we have to still work in the outside, and that is dangerous for people. Electrification of the building stock has to be in collaboration with the Public Service Commission. So if we electrify everything, we can still afford the electricity, and pay raters are being taken into account. Flexibility and preservation of the urban heritage, including climate regulations. Not all of the buildings are going to look the same, and right now Local Law 97 is trying to make all of the buildings be quantifiable and just made out of metrics, there's a possibility to lose heritage and cultural heritage, especially in places like Harlem. Top-down versus bottom-up approaches, which is exactly this reduction of society to just metrics, ensuring that the enforcing agencies have enough stuff to make the transition possible. Right now, last time that I heard, there was only 22 people that were going to be able to account for the majority of these projects coming, which was around like, I think it was like 60,000. So I don't know how that's going to happen. You know, there's also a lot of possible research for that. And finally, you know, collaborations with Columbia University and CUNY to make all of this happen. Like they all have good reasons to do it, and why not? They own a large portion of it. So that's pretty much it. You guys have the website, and hope you can get more answers over there. And now I pass it to Lena.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Really impressive website. So we're switching gears a little bit, again, to talk about the role that community participation can play in implementing climate justice concepts. And actually the group with that presented earlier when I first joined with Panigyatsa and Mariel and Nicole, I think was like a really great example of that. So we had a nice intro there. Thank you guys. Oh, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so when we talk about community participation, I want to clarify a little bit by what I mean by that. So true community participation is sharing of power. And I've selected a local case study of Newtown Creek and observed and assessed the agency, so government agency and community interactions there, with the goal specifically of democratizing environmental decision-making. One specific tool of community participation that I want to focus on is the Community Advisory Group, or CAG, which is essentially an intermediary body of community members that collaborate with the EPA at some Superfund sites. I like to think of the CAG as operating somewhat like a union, as the community members are better able to communicate their needs and concerns to the EPA when they're unified, but their recommendations are not legally binding. Next slide. Thank you. So this is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which is a really useful tool. It presents a typology of 8 different levels, which we can use to aid in analyzing the extent of citizen power that result from different approaches to community participation. So this ranges from non-participation methods, where power holders are engineering surface level public support at the bottom, all the way to degrees of citizen power that carry actual real decision-making ability at the top. In the middle, we have a little more nuance. You have opportunities for citizens to be heard, but not necessarily with accountability or insurance of genuine impact from their feedback. This is a really useful tool, which we will reference again. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So to examine the EPA's approach, we can start with their official handbook, which identifies these 3 primary purposes of community engagement listed there. I want to highlight the third one as it focuses on achieving the perception that public feedback be considered, rather than prioritizing giving the public true decision-making power. I think it's worth noting that the handbook does not at any point in all 156 pages mention that community input must be implemented. Okay. So with that in mind, here is a little background on the case study site specifically. So the Newtown Creek runs between Brooklyn and Queens, and is the site of the Greenpoint oil spill, which leaked between 17 to 30 million gallons of oil from local refineries into the soil and water over the course of more than 100 years. Newtown Creek was added to the National Priority List in 2010, which officially designated it as a Superfund site. And the remediation plan for the creek has been repeatedly delayed since then. It's now not expected until 2028, meaning implementation wouldn't begin until 2032. So this has unsurprisingly led to a lot of frustration in the community. You can go to the next slide. Here's a really useful map from the Waterfront Justice Project that shows the sort of multiple toxic sites along the creek. And it also shows how they overlap with storm surges and flooding risks, which I think is a really great visualization of how the existing environmental issues of the creek will be exacerbated by climate change. And it's a really strong case for why this needs to be urgently and equitably addressed. Next slide. So the Newtown Creek CAG was founded in 2012, so just 2 years after it was added to the Superfund list, and with the goal of advising the EPA of the community's concerns. The CAG meets monthly. It's open to all members of the public, and it also includes a steering committee of community members from local environmental nonprofits, colleges, and community boards, who are sort of the most involved of the community members and volunteers. And that's just I thought it was a useful visual that shows actually both the Newtown Creek Superfund site and also where it sort of overlaps with the Meeker Avenue Plume site. I don't in this presentation have time to talk about the intersection of having multiple Superfund sites in the same area, but it definitely affects community engagement. So we can go on to the next slide for now. Thank you. So just super brief about the sort of little bit about the field work that I've done. So in order to assess the community agency relations at Newtown Creek, I observed and participated in CAG meetings, both online and in person, analyzed a lot of very lengthy EPA documents on community involvement. There are thankfully a number of resources that they have available both internally and to the public in terms of how they want community involvement to, happen at their Superfund sites. And I also had conversations with CAG members about their experience. So ranging from casual conversations at the CAG meetings in person to more formal interviews. All right, next slide. So from that fieldwork, some main points of friction in agency community relations were identified around these issues. Transparency and information sharing, accountability and implementation, and respecting community knowledge. I don't have enough time, of course, to go into too much detail about the observations that maybe led to all of these, but I will go on and highlight one example, which is that on August 8th of 2023, the CAG sent the EPA project management team an official letter detailing their request for transparency and document sharing. This was actually not the first time that they had made such an appeal, just the most recent appeal for better communication. And members report that after each of these requests that have been happening since 2016, there have been improvements, which is really good, right? But eventually that the same frustrations that led them to, send these letters return. Several CAG members noted that the time period seems to be about 2 years in order for those improvements that are initially seen to kind of dissipate, and then they're back to ground zero. So the systemic issues and the imbalance in how the EPA interacts with the community are persisting, even though the response to this specific letter, for example, has been positive. Also in observation, the agency interactions with the CAG demonstrate a pretty poor understanding of the wealth of community knowledge and relevant experience. And the community skills were repeatedly underestimated in meetings. Even members of the CAG who are ecological experts, professors, and engineers who live and work along the creek were generally treated as if they were not capable of understanding technical information. So all that to say, I think we can consider the community participation at Newtown Creek to fall somewhere in the middle of Arnstein's ladder, most likely around the consultation rung, as it lacks any accountability mechanism, but does solicit community input. Next slide. Yeah, so the goal of the EPA is clearly for their plans to be accepted by the community with the least resistance, not necessarily to collaborate with community members on mutually beneficial solutions, although that might sometimes happen. So despite a knowledgeable and engaged community, in this instance, some agreeable EPA representatives and formal guidelines on community involvement, specifically from the EPA, they're ultimately failing to uphold a truly democratic community participation process. It's all comes back to that top-down approach, which Alex also mentioned. It's just not compatible with sharing power, and therefore isn't going to meet the EPA's own stated environmental justice goals. So they're really hamstringing themselves there. Yeah, so because of this, citizens themselves must be the ones to demand transparency, communication, and power sharing in order to have the most democratic involvement. And in this case, the best possible outcome and site cleanup that can be achieved within this established power structure. I didn't include it on the slide, but there is a really interesting sort of overlapping side project with the New York and New Jersey harbor and tributaries focus area feasibility study, which is a great mouthful, which is in very early and preliminary stages, but it's the Army Corps of Engineers working on climate infrastructure plans that are all in very early stages. So I wasn't able to really study the community participation there, but there is certainly potential for there to be better participation, although it hasn't really been, thank you, there hasn't really been signs that this is going to be the case. And that's something that I think would be really interesting to continue studying, specifically, especially in this community that has a lot of history with these environmental issues, in terms of further study. But there's no structured timeline for that that project, so it could be many years. Yeah, all right. I think I'm not too much over time.
Hello, everyone. This is Reem, and today I delve into the critical issue in America and the critical issue in San Diego in specific, which is a topic of minimizing human health risks and mitigation exposure to wastewater spills in urban coastal environments by utilizing remote sensing tools. I'll analyze water quality using a Google Earth engine, and I'll use some inundation mapping and techniques, specifically in the Tijuana River. But before I begin, I want to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to my advisor, Professor Kyle. I want to thank you a lot because your mentorship has been valuable throughout my journey, not only just in my capstone. And I want also to express my sincere appreciation for the inputs and guidance from JPL scientists, from NASA JPL scientists, Erica, Ben, and Dan. Thank you all for your contributions. So now, roughly my presentation outline, I'll go through the problem, the objective, a brief background information about Tijuana River, and I'll go deep into our area of study, and then I'll go into the methodology we use from the data sets, the SAR information, the tides analysis, the inundation, and then I'll end up with the results and the conclusion. Untreated sewage, industrial waste, and runoff from the Tijuana River and its tributaries have poured into the Tijuana Estuary and Pacific Ocean, totaling around 100 billion gallons over the 5 years. This pollution caused by infrastructure failures and improper waste disposal triggers beach closure due to the health hazards from pathogens, flooding risks, and habitat degradation. Over 700 consecutive days of beach closures have resulted, impacting and posing health risk to the residents, to the birds, to the wildlife, to the habitat, to the tourists there, and the local economy. So why I'm studying this? I'm studying this in order to create a guideline for an observational toolkit to identify and distinguish various types of plumes, whether it's a stormwater, a wastewater, a mix, which is a combination of both or nothing. Why? Because the discharge of the Tijuana River into the Pacific Ocean, it's causing this problem. So I'll be determining if the wastewater and the stormwater plumes are optically distinct at first, And then I'll be examining the differences in the spectral reflectance and see how the different plumes are reflected into the satellites, and then integrating the tides data into the inundation mapping analysis. And finally, we want to check whether the Google Earth Engine data is the data we obtained is with the in situ measurements we collected, is there any discrepancies, or they are together, the results are together. So a brief background about Tijuana River. It spans 120 miles along the US-Mexico border. It flows from Mexico into the United States, ultimately reaching the Pacific Ocean. The region features a semi-arid climate, and it's characterized by a warm, dry summer and a cool winter. The river travels through significant urban areas, including Tijuana, which includes more than 2 million people in Mexico, and parts of San Diego in the United States. This cross-border setting adds complexity to the environmental dynamics. And as you can see here in the transboundary flow image, all the yellow points are a flow of a complex discharge, whether wastewater, trash, and even from any stormwater event into the Tijuana River and into San Diego from only Mexico. Now we talked about Tijuana River in specific. I want now to narrow down into our area of study. As we narrow down, our focus is to the Tijuana River estuary mouth, covering a span of 17 kilometers to the south of Mexico, from Imperial Beach in San Diego until San Antonio de la Buenos wastewater treatment in Mexico. This treatment plant now in 2024, it received approximately $500 million in order to upgrade and clean up the sewage from Tijuana that end up in San Diego. And as reported, this treatment plant only releases 50 million gallons of untreated sewage into the Pacific Ocean and into Tijuana and into San Diego. Also, to see how water is discharging, if you can see the second image down, which is the Tijuana River Valley, we want to study here the normalized derived vegetation index, NDVI, the high and low water using Sentinel-1, I'll discuss in few, and see how it's affecting and it's correlated with the water quality metrics. So now we choose our area of interest. Now we want to see which metrics and which water quality metrics we want to use to see the water quality there in Tijuana. So we employ a range of metrics that provide valuable insights into the health and dynamics of this critical ecosystem. First, we want to check turbidity, because it measures the amount of suspended matter in water, causing it to appear foggy. So if we want to see if now I'll show you different images of what we get. The images with high turbidity will discuss why it happens and why it occurs. Chlorophyll, it presents in chlorophyll, it shows the presence in water results in a greenish tint due to the pigments associated with photosynthetic organisms. And then sedum, the color dissolved organic material, is the presence from the decomposition of organic matter in parts, and it shows a yellow to brownish tint to water. And finally, we want to check the sea surface temperature, because when the temperature is higher, which means the environment there, it's not good at all, and that will affect the living, all the fish and everything there. It will be affecting the ecosystem. After we chose our area of interest, we started working and developing a very complex code in Google Earth Engine in order to visualize and analyze the data we need. We used Landsat 8 operational land imager and thermal infrared sensor that has a 16 days of revisit, 30-meter resolution, and it was launched in 2013. It captured detailed imagery in visible and infrared bands, and it enabled us to monitor changes in land cover, vegetation health, and surface temperature. We use Sentinel-2, which is 5 days revisit. It has 10 to 20 meters of resolution, and it was launched in 2018. It offers high-resolution multispectral imagery, and it facilitates precise monitoring of vegetation, land use change, and water quality. Sentinel-1, it has a revisit of 12 days, 20-meter resolution, and it was launched in 2014. It employs radar technology for surface observation, and this technology allows us to employ vertical polarization, which means a vertical transmitter, vertical receiver, and a VH polarization, which means a vertical transmitter, horizontal receiver, to monitor the surface reflected. VV copolarization mode is used to penetrate water surface, allowing for the precise monitoring of water bodies, changing in water level, and the identification of different water features. However, the VH that we used is effective in penetrating through vegetation, monitoring structure, roads, and infrastructure due to its sensitivity to man-made objects. And finally, we use MODIS, Aquaterra satellite, which has a 1 to 2 days of revisit. However, it has a resolution of 10,000 meters, and we use MODIS to check the true color images that I'll show you in a bit. These are the equations we used in order to calculate the water quality metrics I discussed, in order to get the mean of turbidity, chlorophyll, sedum each day from Google Earth Engine using the satellites, and to get the raster images of each in order to export them from Google Earth Engine and then analyze them using QGIS. So in a couple of slides, I'll tell you some summing up just for you to keep in track. So we chose our area of interest, we chose our metrics, we started working in our code, and now we want to see what are the in-situ measurements that we want to use. So to validate the imagery results, we require in-situ data. We utilized NOAA stations for water quality and meteorology located at Bucarillo and Oñanto slow stations, as you can see in the white and green stars. From these stations, we took the salinity, the turbidity, and the temperature, and also the dissolved oxygen. The precipitation station at Brownfield Municipal Airport is denoted by the blue star, as you can see, and we get from it the precipitation, which means which is relevant to the rain. And then the flow gauge data sourced from the International Boundary and Water Commission is presented by the red star, where we get the flow rate of the river. Also, we gathered the in-situ measurements for tides data from also NOAA tide station to monitor water levels. We selected this station, and specific the San Diego station, due to its comprehensive time series coverage spanning from 2017 until 2023. I know this station is not that near to the Estuary River, but it's in the same region, so it can give us an indicator for the tides there, and we can see if it's related to it's affecting the water quality or not. And following the collection of the in-situ data, we developed a Power BI dashboard to streamline the selection of the study dates. So now, after we have the in-situ measurements, we can collect, and the Google Earth Engine images, we can pick the dates for our study. So when it came to picking the dates for each event, we looked into existing research and past studies, and it turns out that for stormwater event, they're typically detected when there's a rainfall without any wastewater discharge for 3 consecutive days. And for the wastewater event, it's the opposite, when there's a discharge of wastewater and there's any rain event for 3 days. And for the mixed, when we have within a 3 days both, and no plume when we have nothing. So once we've settled on days, we need to ensure that in these specific days, we have the right Google Earth Engine data. And sometimes, although we find trends in the field, we struggle to find observational data. So it took us a lot of time to finalize all the dates of our study. And then, as you can see here, we have 14 different dates 10 storm, 10 waste, 10 mix, and 10 plume, and no plume, sorry. We have a column where there's the event itself, and the other column where the image it's captured. Sometimes the image it's captured in the same day, and sometimes between 1 to 3 days, but not more. So a brief from the mid-year analysis, we were able to successfully distinguish the wastewater and stormwater plumes visually using the Google Earth Engine images. And we also distinguished the reflectance and the varied reflectance in mixed plume based on stormwater and wastewater composition. And we got that the true color imagery for wastewater, it shows a green color. I'll show you in a bit the stormwater brown, the mixed greenish brown. And then from the data, it's evident here from the mean data and that we got, it's evident that the stormwater has the highest turbidity level, indicating a high level of suspended particles in the water. The CDOM observation coefficient is highest for stormwater event, but it's somehow all the numbers are somehow close to each other. However, in chlorophyll concentration in stormwater is lower compared to wastewater, indicating potentially different sources or compositions of organic material between the two. Here are different snapshots of turbidity, where you can see all the plume dates, the plume types we have in 4 different dates. You can see in the stormwater event, you have the plume, which showing from the estuary when the water is going out. In the mixed water, you can somehow see some turbidity. However, in wastewater and no plume, as if there's nothing. For sedum, it's similar, but you can see in mixed water, even though the number is low, but the sedum is somehow compared to the coastal region is somehow high, and it shows some attention to dig more and to check why we do have this high concentration of sedum in stormwater and mixed water in these specific 2 dates. And chlorophyll, as you can see, in stormwater, it's more accumulated where the plume is out. However, in mixed water and wastewater, it's more disseminated, especially in wastewater. For the inundation using Sentinel-1, we extracted the VV and VH, and we did some false coloring by putting VV, VH, and then VV in order to see some trends and in order to study first also where's the extent of water, where we have vegetation, and where we have some land cover or some industrial trends. And as you can see in the first image, which is a stormwater event similar to the one I showed you, you can see that we have high vegetation and somehow high water. This indicates why we have high sedum and high turbidity, and that's due to the agricultural runoff with the stormwater event there. Also, in the second one with the mixed water, we don't have that much vegetation and we don't have that much water, and at that point the flow rate and the precipitation, it wasn't that high, and that's why we couldn't see that much a plume and that much trends from this event. And similarly in the wastewater, it has more vegetation and the discharge was huge at that specific day. However, it did not has an impact into the turbidity. After we visualize these images, we want to get deep into the reflectance and the spectral data of each plume type. So we generated the line graphs illustrating the surface reflectance value for each plume type, with error bars representing ±1 standard deviation from the mean. And based on the bands used, it shows that the stormwater has the greatest tendency to reflect light across the spectrum compared to mixed and waste water events or plumes, sorry, and thus stormwater has the highest reflectance due to several factors: particle suspensions, turbidity, and more surface agitation in the form of ripples and the waves, which we will discuss in a few. Interestingly, when we're comparing mixed water and wastewater, the reflectance value appears to be similar within the margin of error indicated by the error bars. This similarity in reflectance implies that these two types of water samples may share similar characteristics in terms of their light reflecting. However, the properties and the composition of the source or the sources are different. After we get the 40, here we're talking about the 40 events of the different plume types. Here we want to get deep into the bands, which bands has the higher reflectance and where they have more, in which bands they are not, they don't have that much high reflectance, and why. So after we found the stormwater has the highest reflectance, we want to dig more into each plume and see how reflectance is within each band. So stormwater plumes demonstrated medium to high reflectance in the green band, transitioning to medium levels in the blue, red edge bands, and low to medium levels in the near infrared. The heightened reflectance observed in the green-reds spectral region 500 to 700 nanometers in the stormwater plume suggests potential sediment loading effects. Furthermore, the analysis revealed considerable overlap, as I told you, between mixed and wastewater plumes, particularly evident in the red edge bands, implying varying concentrations and extent of both wastewater and sediments components. Wastewater and mixed plume predominantly exhibits reflectance peak in the green, potentially attributes to the high sedum or chlorophyll content. And as you can see, the no plume, the reflectance, it's very low compared to all of them. And this reflectance graph, it's exactly compatible with all previous studies, which means that the dates we picked and the analysis we did up until now, it's right. The stormwater we are analyzing, they are right, and the reflectance is as it should be. Before we dig into the tides, we want to see, is the precipitation and the flow rate compatible or not? Because the precipitation is collected in one station and the flow rate is in another, and the both locations are not that near to each other, as I showed you. So in the stormwater events, the precipitation and the flow rate are somehow, I can say, compatible. Of course, we have some discrepancies in some days, which could be applicable because of the different of the weather conditions that would be in that specific day. However, in mixed water, because the precipitation rate is not that high and the flow rate as well, it's very compatible between the two, the precipitation and the flow rate. So now we want to analyze the tides, but before, we want to see the trends during the event, before the event, and after the event. And considering that Google Earth Engine, it has an incomplete coverage for all the dates of our interest, we reach out to Professor Dan Sousa from the University of San Diego in order for him to provide us with true color images from planet data, which planet data has a resolution of 3 meters. These images allows us to visually observe turbidity in the water and its depression towards the north, influenced by prevailing wind direction after the event date. Here, the tides data. before I want to briefly explain what is a tide cycle. The tide cycle are primarily influenced by the gravitational forces exerted by the moon and to a lesser extent by the sun. The gravitational pull of the moon causes the water on Earth to bulge out toward the moon, creating a higher tide on the sides of the Earth facing the moon and on the opposite side. These are also known as the high tide bulges. As the Earth rotates within the gravitational field, different parts of the planet experiences high and low tides. Now that we distinguish the plume types, we have some information about the tide cycle. We want to see how tide cycle is correlated with the in situ measurements and how discharge is affecting them. So as you can see, we have in this specific event a discharge of storm water between 12 December 6 and December 7, the peak. It's exactly the peak where in 12/6 we have this exact time where we have the highest turbidity in the in situ measurement in Boca Rio, which is the station near the Estuary River. However, if I want to compare it with the tides, with the high and low tides, it's not that related. However, it has an insight because we have, for example, high turbidity in two different times where we don't have any tides there. But at the same time, we have 2 peaks or 4 peaks where we have high, or I can say not that high tides. However, we have a peak in turbidity. So it has an influence to the turbidity in this specific case. However, it's more affected by the discharge and the tides at the same time. Here, this is the second station, the Onyantoslao, which is somehow to the inside, not exactly at the estuary mouth. You can see that at the exact time of the high discharge, we have the highest peak of turbidity. And that we can conclude that it's obviously influenced by the discharge. The turbidity is influenced by the discharge of stormwater event. After we see how turbidity is influenced by the tides and the discharge, we want to see how salinity and dissolved oxygen. Regarding salinity and dissolved oxygen levels at the 2 stations, it's important to note a 15-minute lag between their readings. So it's normal, as they told us. During storm events, the influx of storm water reduces salinity levels in the estuary, particularly near the river mouth, where freshwater input is most pronounced. This decline in salinity can impact estuarine organisms adapted to specific salinity ranges, potentially affecting their habitat. Additionally, the lower salinity level can decrease the solubility of oxygen in water. Generally, as salinity decreases, the water capacity to hold the dissolved oxygen will diminish as well. Hence, we observe a drop in dissolved oxygen when we have a high tide with the discharge of stormwater. We also studied a wastewater event, a pre, during, and post. As you can see, it's barely, you can see the change optically between during the event and after the event. You can see somehow some small plumes from the estuary during the event. If you want to compare the tide of the waste event and compared to the storm event, as I showed you before, here the maximum tide is 1.5 feet, which is lower than the lowest tide, the tide event in the stormwater event. The turbidity in the Boca Rio and Onyantoslao. In Onyantoslao, the turbidity was all over the time span. It was somehow constant. However, in Boca Rio, the turbidity on Bukhari, which is at the estuary level, it was somehow constant. However, on Yantuslo, which is somehow deep into San Diego, it has some peaks of turbidity, and this is related to some activity that has happened there. Despite the impact of wastewater discharge on dissolved oxygen levels, the salinity may remain relatively constant due to factors such as the mixing of fresh water and seawater, or the absence of significant change in the tidal patterns, as you see that we don't have that significant tides at that time. And in some cases, the volume and composition of wastewater discharge may not substantially alter the overall salinity of the receiving water body. However, the wastewater discharge introduces the organic matter nutrient into the water. It also holds amount of biological oxygen demand, the BOD, in the wastewater, which can lead to a rapid oxygen depletion in the receiving water body, especially in the estuary. And as you can see, we have the highest BOD in a wastewater discharge, and how it's changing. It's changing based on the discharge of wastewater because it has a lot of BOD inside it. For a mixed water plume, here when we have both together, somehow the tidal cycle is somehow higher than the wastewater, and you can see the peak of the highest turbidity. It was influenced by the tidal activity, by one of the tidal activity, and here it wasn't that influenced by the stormwater event, yet it was influenced by the wastewater event. And that's why the percentage of the turbidities there, you can hear, you feel that it's high. However, in the numbers, it's low. So it's not that much with a higher turbidity. And here, as you can see, the dissolved oxygen, as you can see, when the turbidity is increasing in this number, in this graph, and when we have these peaks of the tides, we are having some decreasing in dissolved oxygen, and that's because the tides and the estuary and the salty water and the fresh water and the wastewater discharge are binding together. That's why we have these decreasing. So as a sum up and a conclusion, the storm water and mixed plumes exhibit a significantly large spatial extents compared to wastewater. The chlorine concentration were relatively constant across the three plumes type, with wastewater showing the highest levels, and the stormwater plume demonstrated elevated levels of sedum and turbidity. The reflectance value in stormwater plumes align with previous findings, peaking in the blue to red ranges, and wastewater plumes exhibited strongest reflectance in the green wavelength, resembling signature of sedum and chlorophyll. And the reflectance in mixed plumes varied widely depending on the composition, either if it's skewed toward more storm or more wastewater. It depends on how the discharge or the amount of discharge of each. And the stormwater plume registered high flow rates and turbidity due to increased sediment, dirt, oil, and other pollutants, in addition to the agricultural runoff. The true color imagery, as I mentioned before, it shows the greenish for the wastewater, brownish for the storm, and the greenish brown to the mixed. And for no plume, it was a dark blue. The high tides combined with significant stormwater event impacted the turbidity level in some of the cases, or in most of the cases, I can say. And the dissolved oxygen levels were found to be influenced by temperature and salinity, and the solubility of oxygen decreases as water temperature and salinity increases, affecting the overall dissolved concentration. And the dynamic of the estuary dynamics at the estuary are quite complex, so it was very hard to connect. In each event, we want to dig more to see what's actually there, what's the how the stormwater is contributing to the other and how tide is contributing. So it was very a complex thing to do. I want to finally re-acknowledge my professor and all JPL scientists. And thank you.